Welcome to the HR on the Offensive podcast, a weekly podcast by Lace Partners, a fundamentally different HR and payroll consultancy. Each week, we tackle some of the most interesting topics facing senior HR professionals. So whether that's from employee value proposition, performance management, people strategy, or even payroll, we cover it all. So join us for the next 30 minutes. And if you like what you hear, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Now, on with the show.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the latest HR on the Offensive podcast. It's me, Chris Howard, joining you as always. And today I have a duet. I'm in the office, in our Lace boardroom. Hopefully the sound is okay because we're right next to a big train station. Pavan Bilkhoo is joining me again. You all right?
Yeah, glad to be here.
I really love talking about skills and challenges that organisations are finding around skills. We were asked by a raconteur to have some comments about how HR leaders can modernise their workforce strategy to tackle what is a very well-known and publicised looming skills gap that we have in the UK. I'm going to ask you a few questions around that because I think it's a particularly fascinating topic. We thought our listeners would find it interesting as well. Before we go into that, though, I'm going to hit you with the fundamentally different questions. Okay, so my fundamentally different question, at the time of recording, you are about to go on maternity leave.
In about a month.
I thought I'd play on that theme a little bit. And I would ask you, if your child grows up, maybe they're 5, maybe they're 10, maybe they're 15, if there was one food item or beverage item that you would want them to not be either allergic to or just don't like, because you want to be able to share in that as a mother with their daughter or son, what would be the one item that you're like, no, please love this, don't hate this particular foodstuff or beverage?
There's a couple of answers to this. I think firstly, because I recently found out that I'm allergic to shellfish. That would have been my go-to on every single restaurant menu. So I wouldn't mind if my little baby was allergic to shellfish now, because I can't participate in that.
Purely selfish reason.
It's selfish reason. So take that off the table. I would love my little one to embrace all Indian food.
Nice.
But specifically dal. I was growing up, dal was a staple. We ate it every day. So, I am going to inflict that on my child.
Lovely. I mean, mine would be a little bit of an easier one. That would be wine. But we'll park that one and focus more on a more interesting discussion, which is this idea around how HR leaders can modernise their workforce strategy to tackle the looming skills gap. Now, we have written, or you guys, you and Gemma Ryle in our team, wrote a blog which kind of touched on some of this. It's called Tackling Potential Skills Crisis, a blueprint for organisational success during an economic slump. Can you just maybe give us a 1 minute of some of the key highlight bits on that? What we'll do is we'll put it in the show notes as well. And then let's talk specifically around, I think I want to touch on the workforce strategy part of that question, as well as the skills gap bit.
Yeah, and I love that article, actually. So I'm glad that you brought it up. I think we can overthink skills crisis. We can react to every single news article that is published. But for us, we tried to break the strategy down into 3 key areas. Number 1, identify areas of your business where skills are evolving. Start with what you know rather than what you don't know. So that can be an easy way of breaking down the problem. The second piece of advice that we give in this article is remove barriers to entry for hot skills. The way you know there is a gap, don't let that stop you from hiring or reskilling or investing in people with that skill set. There are lots of barriers to entry sometimes. We, as HR professionals, have to have guardrails around hiring plans, salary bands, things like that that really restrict us, but remove those barriers to entry where you know you're going to need that skill set. The third recommendation that we put in our blog is about leadership and it's about mindsets. Encourage this way of thinking about skills, or way we think about plugging those skills gaps is non-traditional. You don't have to hire highly paid people if you've got people willing and able to reskill in your organisation. So not only lifting those barriers to entry, which was number 2, but number 3, leadership mindsets will allow you to move much more quickly when you're trying to put these things in place.
Love it. So that very much focuses on things that you can do to tackle the skills gap, which is kind of the looming skills gap part of that. But just before we hit record, you and I were talking about focusing in on the workforce strategy part, which is the elevated part. So can you just give us some thoughts around, well, I'm going to take your words and then play them back to you. But you talked about, actually, you've got to get your workforce strategy in place first, because the skills part of it is just one element of your overall workforce strategy. If you're trying to modernise your workforce strategy, and if you're looking at skills, it's not just skills that you need to look at.
And I go into lots of organisations where chief people officers or members of the HR leadership team say, yeah, we've got a people strategy. Yeah, we've got an HR strategy. And I ask about the workforce as a whole. Do you have a document or a strategy that talks about how you get the right people in the right place at the right time to achieve your short and long-term business goals? And some organisations say, absolutely, I do. I have a very comprehensive strategic workforce plan, which is another level of detail from that. Lots of organisations look a little bit embarrassed, maybe a little bit shy about not having a workforce strategy. And that's because it's bloody hard to do. And so let's start by articulating what the right people in the right place to do the right type of work looks like in a time horizon that is right for your organisation. Typically, I would say for a workforce strategy, make that mimic your business strategy. If your business strategy is 2 to 3 years, let's use that as a blueprint for making sure that you've got the right people at the right place at the right time.
You were just touching there, which I think is worth a bit of a segue into something I've heard you talk about before, which I find fascinating. So I'd like you to elaborate just for our listeners today, this idea of critical skills versus critical jobs. And just going back to what you were talking about, you go in to see an organisation and they say, yep, we've got a people strategy in place. Yep, we've got an approach to skills. I like the way when you describe this idea of, well, is your approach still traditional critical jobs versus critical skills? Can you just maybe touch on that, talk a little bit around that and what we mean when we're talking about this idea of critical skills versus critical jobs?
Yeah, and it's a really good question to ask any HR professional in an organisation. I've done some really interesting projects previously where we compare a research and development specialist in a pharmaceutical organisation and compare it to a competitor and look at that job description and say how similar or different it is. I would say 10 years ago, those job descriptions would be identical and the jobs themselves that people would do would also be identical. That is not the case anymore. Based on what the organisation has invested in terms of tooling, technology, investment in use of AI on the job, those two job descriptions are just not similar anymore. And the skills that are used to do that job are not the same. And so we should be really looking at which skills are most important to that job and giving us more opportunity to say, is that the right job title? Are we composing that job full of the right tasks? And actually, are there bits of that job that are really unappealing that we should automate or get rid of or think of a different way of doing? So you no longer have this like for like when you're looking at the critical jobs or critical job titles anymore. Big, long exercises of looking at critical jobs, I think, is no longer the way that we should be thinking about that. Instead, let's use the language of skills to give us much more opportunity and much greater, I guess, productivity eventually, because we're composing something around the genuine skill set it takes to do that job.
Yeah, let's talk specifically around planning. This idea of strategic workforce planning. We talked about skills planning, like the things you need to think about, because I guess traditionally organizations, maybe there's organizations doing this approach at the moment, or 5 years ago or 10 years ago, you have your workforce plan. You know, we think we're going to grow by 30% next year. And so therefore our current requirements for staff is this. So what we're going to do is layer in just more staff. Yeah, exactly. A very traditional sort of view. So can you, for people listening into this, when we talk about skills planning, perhaps give some advice, some tidbits of information on where people can actually start with that mindset of, well, what do we need to do? Because yesterday, before I listened to this podcast, I was thinking about how I needed an extra 10 marketing people and 50 salespeople and 250 on the shop floor, or 1,000 or whatever it is.
There are certain processes that exist within organisations that force you into that type of thinking. There is a headcount planning process or budget planning process typically given to you by a finance function or a strategy function. So you are forced to think about how big does my headcount need to grow if we're looking at growth. Now, what I have done previously and worked with organisations to do is be really clear about, if we are looking at growing that function, what are the types of things that we should be looking at automating or using AI for as we start to plan that growth. So just because we're growing doesn't mean we need 30% more HR people or finance people, etc. So I think it's really trying to interrogate what those roles look like and what are the skills that you need to run the business and what are the types of skills that you need to grow that business.
Okay. I feel like this is a conversation that's happening in all businesses, certainly businesses that we speak to. What are the digital skills we need? What are the AI skills we need? We know this is happening in the future, so we need to plan for it and start getting people into the business that are experts. So I guess my question is around, why is everyone focusing on that? It might be quite an easy question to answer because it is where the evolution of work is going. But any thoughts you've got on why everyone seems to focus on this digital and AI skills? And then also, I guess, thinking about that kind of leads to, again, something that you've touched on. So perhaps elaborate on that a bit more around specificity to organisation, industry, and even geography. The next thing you need to do is spend all your time focusing on our skills for the future, which is in the digital and AI space.
We use digital AI automation because they are tangible examples of what's changing. You can see it, you can feel it day to day. People are using technology like Copilot in a way they weren't using before. It's more tangible. That doesn't mean that's the only change happening to the business. Now, businesses might make decisions about geographical changes. They might make decisions about how they want to source certain things, and they might be looking at sourcing alternatives, different suppliers, etc. All of these things change the skill profile of what you need within your function or your business as a whole. And so really you should be looking at those tangible examples of everything that's changing rather than focusing just on digital and AI. But we do use that often. HR professionals use that, and people who are skills evangelists use that because it is just very tangible.
We're in a period at the moment where there's lots of media noise around the importance of efficiency and the importance of productivity. And we have written a white paper which talks about the efficiency paradox. Organisations are being told to make cost savings, and so the lowest common denominator is, well, let's just shed jobs. And in this paper we talk about, well, actually there are other things that you can do around technology. Do you think that's why the focus is so much around what do we do, particularly in what I think I'm mainly talking about white collar businesses? The focus is on how do we digitally optimize? How do we drive more AI skills within our business? Because then we're going to have those efficiency or productivity savings. Or is it a little bit more complex than that?
Those of us in the UK are hearing all about skills and digital skills. It's being pushed by the government, really. We have a productivity challenge to solve in the UK connected to the fact that we haven't properly invested in AI and technology capabilities. I think it's part of where we are geographically that we're hearing some of this. But, you know, when you work with manufacturing organisations, they've been on this journey for years and years, and those blue collar jobs we're seeing is fundamentally changing. Like, I have been into car manufacturing places where you don't even see a human. Yeah. It's staggering. That happened many years ago. What we need to catch up with in some of the white collar work is the same thing that's happened over many, many years. We're just getting at heads around some of these highly trained professional workforces. If we think about some work that happens in big legal organisations and in audit firms, these are huge parts of our workforce, particularly in the UK, particularly in the US. I think it's people getting their heads around that will change, and it's changing really fast.
Okay, I want to ask you another question, which is around tackling the looming skills gap. You've talked about skills planning instead of focusing on future role planning. The zoning in on strategic workforce planning you've touched on as well. But I guess where those, if you're a HR professional, if you're a business listening into this, you're focusing, okay, well, let's just say my workforce strategy, we know our approach. We've got all of the different elements tackled. And we're now starting to zone in on our looming skills gap. You talk quite a bit, again, I just want you to expand on it a little bit more around the importance of a joined up approach from education into the world of work. So can you just, I guess, if from a business point of view, what can businesses be doing? I guess to start off with, like, what do you mean when you're talking about that joined up approach?
There has historically been a disconnect between education and the world of work. Sometimes that gap is so stark that you as a business leader are expecting these graduates or school leavers to come out of their places of education with skills that actually when they enter the workplace they don't have. And so you've got this huge gap, this chasm to close. And that could be things like softer skills in terms of collaboration, in terms of, how does the business work? How do you work with other functions? How do you read your company accounts? There could be things like that are really easy to close, or they could be huge gaps in what now happens in the world of work. If you're looking at an engineering firm, university with an engineering degree, able to go straight into that job, or do you actually need to upskill them significantly before they can actually start doing their work and adding value? There is a gap. And the more I speak to businesses, that gap is coming from people who are new to the organisation. So we need to do something really fast. Part of what the CBI does is to try and close the gap and start the conversation between universities or schools and big organisations, industries in the UK to say what are the skills that we need to do that. But I do believe that the government does need to step up, start talking to universities and schools about the critical skills that we need now and in the future to be successful as a country. That needs to be guided by business. We know what we will need. We know where some of these things are falling short, and the conversation needs to happen so that we don't end up with people who are willing and coming from these institutions but not able to add value, and that results in cost to the business. Not a great perception of people coming out of these institutions.
How does that manifest itself? Are we talking about businesses collectively lobbying?
Yeah.
Is it through someone like the CBI and then the government working with the CBI to put programs in place that can have a natural evolution, transition of somebody from whatever stage they are in education into that world of work?
Well, exactly. And I think the barrier here is starting to use the language of skills. We don't use the language of skills. So you've got this chasm that I talk about, and you've got the institutions giving you this, and you've got the world of work wanting this. But if we start to talk about skills, we can bridge that gap really easily. One thing is trying to give some really good embedded skills in our people so that business and the UK can generally benefit. I mean, globally, we should be benefiting from those. So if we start to break this barrier, stop talking about jobs, stop talking about qualifications, let's start talking about skills so that we know that exactly what you're giving us institutions is exactly what we need. Now, we know organisations need to invest in early careers. That's why every single organisation I work with certainly has an early careers programme. But let's just be super targeted about what businesses are expected to invest in versus what we're expecting from certain institutions. School leaver programs from big organisations have been a godsend here. They really look at the skills you're getting from, those school leavers and enhancing them from scratch. So there's no real expectation for that group, certainly, that they're going to come with a flag of, I am an engineer, so I'm going to be able to go on site, tomorrow. There is just more thinking that goes into those school leaver programs. And maybe we need to do that for university leavers as well, people coming into a different profession. But We need to start that conversation between these institutions and business.
This is a little bit of a leading question because we've just had this campaign we've been running called Becoming Skills Powered, and it's all around skills-based organizations. I feel like, and please feel, I'm just going to be deliberately provocative. I feel like there are many organizations out there that kind of feel like this is a bit of a utopia that can never be achieved, because it's having to unpick the very fabric and design in which our business has been constructed with some organizations over hundreds of years.
Yes.
My question is more around, it sounds like to achieve some of those barriers or to smooth the transition from education into the world of work, you're leaning towards skills-based organizations. But what about those organizations that are naturally, I guess, skeptical about, well, we can't just unpick everything that we are?
Yeah. I think looking at what is the organisation that we want to become might be a really good place to start, because organisations always evolve, and we've got some of the longest running organisations that have changed hands multiple times in their lifetime. So things do change. Some of the things that we talk about when we talk about skills-based organisations, specifically mobility across the organisation, great career experiences, feeling wedded to the organisation, not necessarily your job title. These have existed through the ages. They've always been around. It's just that only a few people who have benefited from that. And it's people who have visibility, those people who have gone from one project to another. And what we're saying in skills-based organisations is that should be opened up to everybody within the organisation. It should be a democratic process that gives you an option to do something different, not changing the fabric of the organisation. These things have existed before. I think that just takes the spike out of it, that takes the fear out of it. The second thing that holds us back, we talk about that in the blog, is there are barriers to taking a skills-based approach, or there to start thinking about skills. And those barriers are legacy thoughts about job titles and legacy thinking about pay grades and restrictions on hiring. So things that are within the control, typically of the CPO. So if you're really clear that taking a skills-based approach could help you be more productive, or that there's a looming skills crisis in one area of your business, if you're really serious about that, the things that can unlock these barriers are very easily in control of the CPO.
We are almost out of time, so I think I'll just end on one final question, which is nice. Simple one for you, like he says. Kind of final thoughts. You were just talking to there, so a CPO is listening into this. The original question, just to go right back to the start, was how can leaders modernise their workforce strategies to tackle looming skills gaps? Any final bits of, if you only do one thing about this that you'd say to a CPO that you've just gone in to see and they've asked you that question?
I would say, take time to think, because we are going at 100 miles an hour. Every CPO I know is working on multiple transformation programs, has fires that they're fighting. Some of these things that we've talked about just don't even get thought about. And it's not for want of trying. It's, that Saturday afternoon with a glass of wine, you're like, oh, maybe I should think about this, or I really need to spend some time on workforce strategy. What I would say is, if you can, take a couple of hours out, speak to an advisor. You will have a strategic advisor, you will have a coach, and start to knock around some ideas around how you might tackle skills or how you might help part of the organisation that is fundamentally changing. Everything that we've written in blogs and everything that I talk about is fairly logical and very practical. The thing stopping most CPOs from driving this agenda is just time.
Thank you, Pav, for giving me some time today. Hopefully you found that as fascinating as I did. Hopefully we've helped to answer a few questions. If you want to reach out to Pav, you can do so. You can access her details on our website or connect with Pav on LinkedIn. From myself and from Pav, thank you very much for checking out the latest edition of the HR on the Offensive podcast. Hopefully we'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.